Let's kick off. So I'm Jenny Reinbrook. I'm Interim Director of Programmes at NHS Providers, and I'm the chair of today's event. Thanks very much for joining us. This is the latest in a series of virtual events that we run as part of our provider collaboration programme, and the aim is really to share good practice and learning on provider collaboration hot topics for board members and programme directors, and it's very much shaped on the topics that are most important to you at the moment. And today's focus is on provider collaborative governance, and we're going to draw out some of the pros and cons of the different models that you're all adopting, and just have a look at how provider collaborative governance has been evolving over time. We've got two really great case studies today from different sectors and systems that have taken a very different approach, so I think that's going to provide for a really rich discussion. And we're also going to finish with a very quick outline of a publication that we're working on with Brown Jacobson on good governance in provider collaboration, where we want to do a quick test with you at the end that the topics are going to be the right ones and that it's going to be genuinely useful to you. So let me just introduce our speakers for today. We're joined by Caris Esseen and Selina Douglas from the North East London Mental Health Learning Disability and Autism Provider Collaborative. Welcome to you both. And we're joined by Lucy Cole, Programme Director from Wyatt. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Before we dive in, just usual housekeeping. Obviously, the sessions are going to be recorded, so we'll be able to circulate this with a note from the webinar afterwards. So don't feel like you have to scribble away. We'll capture the key points and whiz that round in a post-event email. Do please just put questions and comments in the chat. It would be great when we get to the Q&A if people are able to have cameras off. That's always nicer for the speakers if you're able to do that. Do just raise your hand or use the raise hand function to come in, and do also put any other comments and questions in the chat as we go, and any thoughts and reflections. So without further ado, let's dive in. And I think we've got Selina with us, as well as Caris in the audience. So do please come in to share your learning from North East London.
Thank you, Jenny. And yes, like you said, there's myself and Caris here today. So I'm Selina Douglas. I'm Executive Director of Partnerships for North East London Foundation Trust. And this is absolutely a joint enterprise and development with our colleagues in East London Foundation Trust. And Caris is here to represent them. Caris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Caris Esseen. I'm Deputy Director of Integrated Care at East London NHS Foundation Trust.
Absolutely. And Caris is part of our team that absolutely help us manage the North East London Mental Health Learning Disabilities and Autism Collaborative. And probably we wouldn't have got it off the ground if it wasn't for Caris and all of her hard work. So let's move on then in terms of our presentation. First slide. Okay, so the North East London Integrated Care System is made up of 47 primary care networks working together at a neighbourhood level for a population of between 30 to 50,000. Interestingly enough, in North East London, when the primary care networks were being established, they weren't necessarily just based on geography. They were also based on where people could work together as well. And that's been a bit of a challenge sort of going forward. And we're starting to look at that as part of our collaborative development and our integrated neighbourhood team development. But having said that, there's some great enthusiasm, and we build on having a really good clinical leadership from our GP networks and our GP providers. And that's a really important thing. And across our 7 places and our 7 local authorities, actually having that GP leadership really helps us in terms of developing the collaborative. At our 7 places, that is where we are co-terminus with our local authorities, our voluntary sector and social enterprise partners, and also our other key stakeholders such as health watches. And also in North East London, one of our dynamics is in most of our areas, we have an acute trust hospital. So we have the Royal London Tower Hamlets, for example, and we have Whipps Cross in Waltham Forest. Now, across Barking, Dagenham and Havering and Redbridge, we have 2 big acute trust hospitals which cover that patch. But actually, surprisingly enough, our residents don't necessarily just go to their acute hospital that is in their patch. Our Royal London Hospital is absolutely a centre of trauma-based care. And also, as populations are growing in North East London, a lot of our residents from, say, Barking and Dagenham go into the Newham footprint. So whilst place is really important, we do have this movement of individuals across North East London. And that's why working across a collaborative across North East London is really important, because we're looking at what are some of those trends, what are some of the things we can do together, but importantly, what are some of those demands going to look like in the future years? We've got a number of collaboratives in North East London. We've got an acute provider collaborative. We've got a mental health, learning disabilities and autism collaborative. We've got a community health collaborative. We've got one emerging around voluntary sector and VCS. And we've got a primary care collaborative. And I think for me, the real advantage of having those collaboratives in place is we are bringing together all of our providers, but importantly, it's really a tripartite relationship with our integrated care system leaders and, like I say, our clinical leadership to be able to take this forward. We're here today to talk about the mental health and learning disabilities and autism collaborative, and I think that's probably I'm not sure if anybody's here from North East London. I'm probably biased. It's probably the most developed out of the collaboratives, and it builds on a number of years of working together to try and meet the needs of people who have mental health, learning disabilities and autism across North East London. So whilst it's fairly new in the new governance structures, actually we've been working together like this for a long time. We've also got a number of integrated care system programmes around things like cancer, maternity, population health. In North East London as well, our chair is Marie Gabriel, and we have a real focus on health inequalities. And Marie chairs the National Race Health Observatory under the ComFed, and that really gives us a real focus and a keen grip on what's happening in terms of health inequalities. That then fits into the Integrated Care Board and our Integrated Care Partnership. So it's a complicated system, fairly densely populated, across North East London, delivering to a population of around, I think it's about 3 million, but I'll ask Caris to correct me because I may well be wrong there, but a growing population, predominantly young. But however, we are seeing the age profile of our residents increase as people get older across our populations. Very transient, lots of new builds, lots of population growth in areas such as Barking and Dagenham and Newham. And that really presents us with challenges in terms of planning for our services across North East London. Challenges and opportunities, I like to say. There's real opportunities as well to develop that. Caris, have I forgotten anything on this slide you'd like to add? No. Okay. Oh, go on.
No, I was just going to say you've absolutely covered it all.
Perfect. Next slide, please. So who are we as a collaborative? And I always look shocked when I look at this slide, because I always look at our logo and think that represents where we are as a collaborative. We are trying to be as inclusive as possible. And actually, I'm going to bring Caris in a minute about how we engage with lived experience and our service users. Whilst it's important to have the big statutory players, our local authorities, our place-based agencies, our faith organisations, and in North East London, we really found through COVID that, quite frankly, as a statutory mental health trust, we couldn't get into. As a statutory provider of community services, we couldn't get into. And that importance of being really coterminous and working hand in glove with our community and faith sector organisations is really important. I've already spoken about primary care and other providers and other NHS providers. I think what is really, really interesting at the moment is how do we develop that into the integrated neighbourhood model, and what will that look like as a collaborative for us as we try and offer services as local as possible. But what has been a real success is getting that lived experience view, both from our adults but also from our children and young people, and developing that as part of our planning going forward. And I think that's a really important point that I, really, when I go to these sort of events, and we are also an innovator site around collaboratives, I always say that really adds to what we're doing, getting that real voice of people who use our services. Caris, is there anything you want to add about this? Because you've really been championing this about how we get service user voice into our collaborative.
So this is a running theme throughout the presentation, so we risk bashing people over the head with it, but there's definitely something about it's been a real eye-opener so we'll talk about the formal governance of our collaborative in a moment, and the membership of our committee, but having the voice of carers, of service users across North East London has fundamentally challenged the chair, the non-executive directors, the executive directors, the clinicians who sit on that committee to think and act differently, to do business differently in a really positive and challenging way. And there's the next sort of task is to think about the substructures that really support that. But we've made some really good strides in ensuring that it's an inclusive committee that represents the priorities of everybody in North East London.
I think that's a really important point, and I get your point, Caris, about we may have this over and over again in terms of our themes, but actually it makes a real difference to what we're doing, and it's been really crucial to the development. And for me, we are a subcommittee, a joint committee at the moment of the ICB. We are looking to be a formal subcommittee with formal delegation. I'm going to talk about that later, but also to take delegation from our two FTs, because we're both foundation trusts, ELFT and ELFT, and to really give it that power to be able to motor on. And that's a really important principle, because it puts it on the same standing as the other collaboratives, but also gives it that decision-making power, which we want to give and delegate and work as much as we can with our places. But actually, there has to be the oversight of this across North East London to look at how we're tackling health inequalities, and we're looking at how our services have been delivered across the whole of the place. Next slide, please. So, as I said, this builds on a journey, and I feel quite privileged because I was sat on the CCG side of the journey at the beginning of this. So I remember what it was like to be in the clinical commissioning group when the STP was formed, and how we began to work on our mental health programme and our transforming care partnerships. And that was way back in 2016. It feels like a not so long ago, but we've had a little thing called a pandemic in the middle of it. So from there, we were looking at how do we develop, and what is our goal, what are our goals across North East London in terms of mental health, learning disability and autism. And at that stage, we actually did a piece of demand and capacity piece of work across the whole of the patch to say, what were the needs of people with mental health? What were we going to need look like for demand and capacity? Actually, then we had a little thing called a pandemic. That threw us in terms of what we need to do in terms of our mental health services. As you know, the NHS went into a very reactive and responsive framework. We have then, since 2021, we've established a single mental health, learning disabilities and autism programme board under a system SRO. So Paul Kanaminas, who is currently the CEO of ELFT, was our system SRO in terms of taking that forward, but absolutely building on the leadership of people like Navina Evans, who was the previous CEO at ELFT, and really helped us develop that and think about how we're going to work together jointly. In January 2020, the Mental Health Collaborative, Learning Disabilities and Autism Collaborative was recognised by the Integrated Care System and Trust Executives. And when we say that, what we mean is it really became part of that planning process. Planning for the last 2 years has been done by the collaborative. Actually look at our misallocations, so our mental health investment standards and our system development fund as part of those collaborative plans. We look at our trajectories underneath the operating plan as part of our collaborative plans. They are not sat aside. We sit together and we plan together on what we can do. We also look, importantly, in North East London and as in other areas, on things like what is going on with our flow in terms of our urgent and emergency care networks. And that's been a really important piece of work we've been doing. We held our first meeting of the ICB, Mental Health and Learning Disabilities Collaborative Subcommittee in November 22. And we have recently, and that was chaired by Marie Gabriel as the system chair, but we have recently appointed a joint chair across ELFT and NELFT who now chairs that committee. So really to give it that standing of importance across our organisations. And like I say, this year, it's been a really tough financial year for everybody. Everybody on this call will be aware of that. We've actually made those decisions jointly across 2 organisations and with the system to make sure that we are delivering a balanced plan. Now, interestingly, and having been around in North East London for a number of years, I'm not sure we could have done that way back in 2016. Because it would have ended up with us having sovereign conversations around what our sovereign organisations needed to deliver that, whether it was the ICS in terms of a balanced budget, whether it was ELFT or NELFT in terms of where we were going. But this year, for the first time ever, we've been able to develop that together and to make sure we plan together, building on that long history of trust. And actually, I'd use the term psychological safety. We were able to say things that probably we wouldn't have said before. But importantly, we've also re-looked at some of our allocations around our SDF, our System Development Fund, and looked at the areas that really need the money. And we've actually looked at delivering that system development fund in a different way this year. And again, that wouldn't have happened without us coming together and having some of those frank conversations. Caris, anything you want to add?
No, let's tell everyone what we're doing next.
Right, no problem. Next slide. So this is our really complex governance structure, and we've tried to make it as simple as possible. But in the world of governance, we do like to have a structure, and we do like to be really clear about who is represented at our various levels. I'm not going to go into very much detail in terms of the sort of top levels and how it all fits together, because I think I've probably given you the overview of that. I would say having our service users and carers with lived experience on that collaborative is really, really important. Having representatives from our places, local authorities and primary care is really, really important. And also from our other collaboratives. We are not a collaborative in isolation. We work across North East and North Central London around our children's and adolescent mental health services in a collaborative. And actually, we have representation there. As I said, we're hoping to replace this with a proper joint committee across ELFT, NELFT and the NEL ICB in the coming weeks. I just want to call out that we have under the collaborative work improvement networks, and this is where we're really motoring. If there were 2 or 3 key ingredients to making this work, it's been getting a service user voice, it's been getting senior buy-in, but it's also about hearing the voice of our clinicians in terms of what we're doing and bringing that together across North East London. And there was a dread in terms of our clinicians coming together, because there's always been that competitive, who's doing best in terms of the trajectories position. And actually what we've been able to do in terms of developing the collaborative is to bring that clinical voice and to say, what are the things we can share and we can steal with pride? What are the things that we want to jointly work on and some of our challenges? And that's been a real success as well. And I would say those 3 key ingredients, service user voice, senior buy-in, and getting the clinical voice at the heart of this are absolutely crucial. So I think it's been a work in progress. We still, and we get challenged a lot by our service users and carers about our terminology and the complexity of our papers. And I think they're right to challenge us. If we can't make it simple, then we don't really understand it. So I think for me, actually, it's a work in progress, but we're absolutely developing. And as we go through the coming months, we will continue to develop that collaborative. We absolutely haven't got it all right, but we are sort of learning, and we're learning organisations to be able to think about what that future needs to look like. Caris, anything from you?
Sorry. So I was just going to add that on the next slide, we've got something about why a joint committee, which I think is quite helpful to talk through, because we did look at different models, didn't we? And we were looking at all kinds of different ways of forming and storming back in sort of 22, the early part when we were really first recognised as a collaborative across the system. And it's just the governance model that we think is going to best help us to achieve what we're aiming for. So I wonder if we just quickly cover that off.
Let's go on to the next slide. Go on, Caris.
So when we first started looking, we were looking at everyone had grand ambitions about could this big delegation come to providers from the ICB? That comes with masses of risk. There's a huge due diligence process that's very complicated. In this arrangement, where the ICB is a fundamental member of the Joint Committee alongside of Elfed and Nelft, the statutory responsibility for those ICB functions does remain with the ICB, but it's a joint exercise arrangement. So they're inviting providers to help them to exercise those duties and responsibilities as opposed to an outright delegation. What we think this could do is help the providers to actually earn a sense of autonomy. So it can facilitate incremental delegation of responsibilities and functions as that trust, as the robustness of our conversations continue to happen, and the governance arrangements themselves mature. Equally, Elfed and Nelft boards can also delegate some of their Health Act functions into the Joint Committee, particularly around population health planning, which we think could be really important for equally sharing and risks together. But coming back to that idea of, well, would we be looking for an external delegation in the future? It's a bit of a prototype. Having that Joint Committee structure would enable the ICB to withdraw at a future time if they wanted to. And lastly, coming back to what the Health and Care Act allows under the new sort of 65Z5 section, we could also create pooled funds in a way that providers couldn't do before. So there are huge opportunities for the Joint Committee, and that's why we're pursuing what we are. Selena's outlined many of the opportunities that come with all of this, but also the challenges that we're grappling with in a very live way. So that was the only piece that I kind of wanted to sort of contribute. Selena, do you want to finish this off?
Yeah, I think the last thing for me is also, when do we take this out into the public arena? And it is a live debate, even spoken about last night at 5 o'clock, about, is our next committee going to be a public committee? And we are really clear, led by our chair, Eileen Taylor, that actually we should be doing our business in public. We shouldn't be sat in a anonymous committee making decisions around, circa £500 million worth of resources. Actually, it should be done in the public and in the public domain. But that brings with it all of those challenges around, what does that look like? How do we ensure we keep confidentiality? What are some of the challenges we've got to do? But it's a real live debate now about how do we do this and how do we make this fair and transparent and open. And we're considering doing that from our July meeting. So it is absolutely a work in progress, and all of these elements are moving towards trying to make that decision making as streamlined as we can, as representative of our local communities as we possibly can, and making best use of our resources, and to tackle some of the fundamental challenges we have in this area around demand and capacity. Our demand since COVID is outstripping our capacity. And I know that's happening elsewhere in other NHS services, but we need to really think about how we are working across the whole health, social care and wider domains to think about how we upstream some interventions to be able to help us then think about the future of our services. Next slide, please. Key points of learning and challenges. So these are the ones we're going to share with you. I think there's been lots of robust conversations about our committee, and actually one of the real fundamental things is that we have an executive that meets every Tuesday that goes through all of this, and no matter what is going on in each of our respective organisations, actually we come together and try and thresh this out, and we don't all have the same view. And I think that's really, really important, that you own that, you're comfortable in that uncomfortable space, and you're able to move through. Our number one thing is lived experience to our subcommittee is valuable beyond measure. That is so important to us. I hope you can feel that through the presentation. It's integral. Defining delegation from our three statutory bodies is contentious. We are still we're still both FTs. There's still the ICB, statutory responsibilities as well. But I think we are earning that, as said in the last slide and from Caris, we are earning that through the way in which we are managing our planning processes and working on our challenges. Vertical integration into places. Places are the centre of delivery for us as far as we are concerned, and even at that PCN level, that is the centre of where we need to be delivering. That is where our communities are, that is where our communities live, and that's where we need to be delivering. However, that can bring complexity, and it also, as you saw from the first slide, you can see how many people's voices you've got in that, and that can add to time to what we're doing, but also can also mean that you get, and I'm a real advocate of this, that richness of that debate. Our legacy arrangements, our journey from 2016, we're quite lucky because we've had the vast majority of senior leaders, whilst they've moved positions, apart from our ICB colleagues, actually have been in the system for quite a while, and that really has added value. But I would also say that we've had new players into this as well, and that's been really important to get that fresh blood, those fresh eyes. You can get a bit, oh, this is all, one track, this is what we're doing. So actually having a bit of fresh eyes into that has been really, really good. We're thinking about assurance, we're thinking about performance management. My conversation earlier and my example earlier of clinical improvement networks, actually, we know we have some challenges around some of our delivery. And actually, where do we have those conversations? We should have it with our clinicians sat in the room, and our clinicians leading that debate and leading those conversations around the future. And for me, that's a really good piece of work about how we do that. And also, how do we manage programme oversight once we've got delegation in place as well? And what does that look like in terms of the ICB governance? Caris, is there anything else you want to add in terms of learning and challenges? No,
I think we've covered it.
I think that's it. So happy to hand over to Jenny if there's anything or any questions anybody's got.
Thank you so much to both of you. What an amazing progress you've made, and so much insight that you've just shared there. And it's really, I think, really helpful to see those ambitions around the Joint Committee as a way of getting 3 statutory organisations to participate on an equal basis, and how you see that evolving over time to just facilitate that kind of incremental delegation of responsibilities as the relationships mature and develop. I'm sure there are questions, so can I just open it up to the floor? Do please just raise your hand. I've just seen one. I see S. Tappenden. Do come in.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have put my name in properly. I'm Sam from
Hi, Sam.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. It's really useful. I think we're in a very similar journey, but my question was around the Joint Committee and whether you're interested or seeking to bring in non-health partners. So, for example, local governments, voluntary sector, etc., because I've noticed in the legislation it's a little bit vague in terms of other prescribed bodies. So I just wondered if you looked at the kind of broader partnerships arrangements.
Great question, Sam. Thank you. Selena, Caris, do you want to come in on that?
I'm happy to make a start, Selena, if that's good for you. So we already have a exec director of social care from one of our local authorities in North East London sitting as a full member on the committee. There will also be a voluntary sector representative as a full member on the committee, and also we've got 4 seats for people with lived experience who obviously don't come from services at all. They are using services, they're aware of services, but they're not coming from that kind of statutory health background. And our support from NHS England through the Innovator Scheme has really assured us that it's a permissive framework, so we can include and invite whoever we want to participate on this committee. And just to come back to one of Selena's points earlier, that's also partly why we think meeting in public is really important, so that it's not an exclusive thing. Where you can't have unlimited membership of committees, you need them to be able to function. There certainly needs to be an opportunity for other people who are interested to come and hear what's being discussed and feed in their thoughts through other means.
And can I just check from a kind of legal structural perspective? So you've mentioned that those organisations have members on that committee, but will their organisation be a formal part of that committee?
So it wouldn't be a joint committee of a local authority and the trusts and the ICB. The joint committee will have delegated responsibilities from the 3 NHS statutory bodies, but what you can do is invite people from outside of those organisations to sit as members on those committees, have voting rights and to participate in decision making without necessarily including them as part of the governance. At the moment, I don't think you could have a joint committee of those 3 NHS bodies plus a local authority. I don't think that's permitted, but you certainly can involve whoever you want to in the committee itself.
Thanks, Caris and Sam. Great question. So I'm just going to pass to Marie, and then I'm going to come to Anton in the chat. So Marie, do come on in with your question.
Thanks very much. It's a really good presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I can see real similarities with some of the new opportunities we're trying to develop as well. I just wondered how this links in with you talked about your CAMS SpecCom provision and how they sit on your board. I just wondered how that works with any other specialist commissioned areas, or previously were specialist commissioned areas, and things that are now provider-led contracts, and thinking more around secure and eating disorders. Do you have a similar sort of arrangement there?
So at the moment across North East London, it's just our our North Central and North East London CAMS collaborative that we've given a seat to, because that's the only one we've got there. But as we begin to expand it, we are going to need to think about what other specialised commissioning bodies need to be on it. I've got to say, having that individual there representing really adds value. And we are able to have conversations around the whole CAMS continuum across the whole of that position. So for me, I think that is really positive. We're currently scoping perinatal as an area to come down, and for us to have a collaborative again across North Central and North East London. And those conversations are ongoing at the moment with NHS England about us taking the delegation around that. And again, we'd have a representative of that specialised commissioning sat on our committee, because what we don't want is for decisions outside the committee to have an impact on whatever we're doing in terms of things that need to happen in the committee. And also, because we've got the breadth, I'm not saying that specialised commissioning collaboratives don't have this, but we have the breadth of lived experience, we've got the breadth of local authority, the voluntary and community sector sat around that table. It really adds to the conversation, particularly around the areas we're looking at around CAMS and perinatal, because they all, whilst not delivering services, all have a sort of stakeholder in that. So for me, I think that's a really important principle, that they're sat around the table and they're having that conversation. And as Caris said, we've had lively debates around who is sat around that committee table and who gets what status and who can vote, who can't vote. I mean, I've been around for a number of years, at least 25 now. I very rarely have seen a vote, but we need to make sure that people are really clear about who takes responsibility. And in the chat, I can see the question about contracts and decision making. And that is something where we need to be really clear around who is making the decisions around the overarching contracts for both of our trusts. And they are sat as part of the conversation that we have at the Mental Health, Learning Disabilities and Autism Committee, and the delegation of the money sits with the committee. But actually those contractual conversations are held through the contracts team at the ICB, and a report then goes into the committee, because we have to be really clear. This is a lot of public money. We need to be really transparent about how we're spending it. So I would keep it as open as we possibly can without turning it into a committee of thousands, which we were in danger of ending up with, weren't we, Caris?
Thanks, Marie. Great question. Thanks, Selena, for that, and for picking up Anton's question in the chat. Sohab, nice to see you. Do come on in with your question.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Selena and Caris. Love the illustrations. I think I've got a few new ideas to use in some of my presentations. Nice to see another collaborative in the same space. We're about a month away from setting up our joint committee, and we've gone through a similar sort of train of thought. But I'm interested in your sort of thoughts around membership versus and actually decision making, as opposed to in attendance, because we went through all of that. So I think what you've described as in attendance, as opposed to membership, which is the formal decision makers, which then gets into voting versus consensus. We've had a big issue there. Your scope of your joint committee, because we've had an issue around what is operational, left to individual statutory organisations, versus what is delegated or is joint exercise by the joint committee. Resourcing of the infrastructure, your approach to managing risk, pooling of resources you've touched on. We're not going there yet, but it's something we've built into the vehicle so that we can look at further down the road. Combining section 65Z5 and 65Z6 with section 75 to have a broader, that's a subsequent stage for us. And I guess the last point for me is, well, how have you pulled all that together? What's your documentation? Because we're in the process of just finalising our collaboration agreement in the terms of reference, which sits within, and then that's kind of the start point for our joint committee, which is a subcommittee of 4 organisations. Therefore, there has to be some level of formality around this. So I'm not throwing a lot at you there, but I'd welcome some thoughts on any of that if you've got. And I'm sure Christian Dingwall will be picking up some of this somewhere down the road. So don't feel as if you need to answer all of that.
Thanks. So Selina and Caris.
So I'll kick off, but I'm not going to be able to answer every single one there. I'll give it a go. In terms of where we are in terms of our journey, we are really lucky to have Brown Jacobson supporting our ICB. So we have regular live conversations about what is permissible through the legislation and what can we deliver. So some of that, having looked at the agenda, maybe will be covered later in the agenda around what can we actually do in terms of going forward. In terms of the formality around our decision making, actually we've built on quite a lot of trust and, like I say, psychological safety in that decision making, and actually probably having the joint chair has enabled us to take a couple of steps forward around how we're going to work and what that looks like across our organisations. But there was, as I said earlier, lively debates around who is a committee member, who is in attendance, and we made some decisions there that are probably a little bit different from other areas. Caris, do you want to talk about the discussion around our service users? Because we had a lively debate about, we're not excluding anybody. So what does that look like, Caris?
So there was a big back and forth about do you just restrict membership to the statutory bodies that are actually delegating functions in, or do you make everyone a member? And then it was like, well, the local authority should be a full member, and so should be a full member. And actually what we determined was that a 2-tier system was just going to be problematic. As soon as you start creating perceived layers of superiority within that committee structure, we just felt that it would send the wrong message. And the group, one of the single biggest contingent of members of the committee are actually service users and carers. They're not any individual organisation. And so not to make them full members sent also a really awful message. So in the end, everyone's a member. So we don't have a participant category. We don't have an in attendance category. Everyone who is invited to attend is a member of the committee, has rights to vote, participates in decision making in a real way. That could be very risky, but we've taken the view that this is a participatory committee that also is about formalising a way we've been working for a long time. So when just picking up on that thing about documentation, we've been doing this without the formality around it for a while, as Selina outlined in that kind of roadmap. We've had the infrastructure there really since 2016, and because of the ring-fence budgets around, or for want of a better term, ring-fence budgets around mental health investment standard and service development funding that comes down from NHS England, there is quite a neat ring around what the committee is responsible for in terms of a delegation for a particular set of resources in the system, and the planning for that the use of those resources, and the responsibility for performance against the way that those resources are deployed. That actually the hardest thing is now putting in writing what we've been doing, because suddenly it looks a bit frightening, but actually it's already been happening, if that makes sense. So we are trying to catch up with the paper trail, and it can be, and as Selina mentioned, it's a bit contentious at times, but we're getting there. But it's a journey for sure.
I mean, I think one of the most sort of telling sessions was when we were going through the planning round, and we got our letter back to say, try harder. I know that's not the technical term, but we were told to sort of try harder. What are you doing? And we got our CFOs in the room. So we had the CFOs from the system, we had the CFOs from our foundation trusts. And like I say, I've been on this journey a number of years, as has Caris. Caris has been part of this team for a long time. And I remember probably 2 or 3 years ago, our CFOs would have absolutely taken the sovereign position of this is what we are doing. And there is no way we are looking at our balance sheets. There is no way we are going to be reallocating any of our MIS or our SDF to be able to help in terms of this system position. That entirely has changed this year. And our CFOs are in agreement around what the overall reach is. and what we have to deliver in terms of our balance sheets to be able to help the whole of the system. And that has been such an eye-opening conversation as part of this, to get them on board alongside the CFO from the ICB. And as part of that negotiation, and I hope colleagues are here from North East London, we've also been able to negotiate what is actually sat in that committee, because we've been so flexible around our approach and not taken sovereign status in terms of our FT status. Actually, we've turned around and said, in our committee, we want these following conditions to be applied. And that is where we're sort of building on that journey and taking that journey forward. What is really interesting is our places, and our places challenging us about how, historical allocations that they feel are unfair. And actually, interesting enough, I had one of the directors of adult social care email me a couple of weeks ago around a particular issue in one of the boroughs, saying, well, the committee needs to make that decision. Now, that was really telling, because he didn't just go straight to the ICB and say, this is an ICB NHS issue. He was saying, this is the committee's issue. What are you doing as a committee to deal with those historic funding arrangements, which no longer are representative of the way in which our communities live, work, breathe, move across our boroughs? And that was a real turning point in the shift of where does that power sit. And I'm not really a power person myself, but actually we do need to make sure the committee is able to make those decisions and able to work together to be able to transform some of the things that we all want to deal with.
Yeah, Jenny, can I just one very quick point, and that is,
do come in a quick point, and then we'll move on and hopefully loop back to some of these questions.
Yeah. It's great that it's a continuation of the journey, and that's where we've been in terms of the natural next step is. But the important point for us has been to manage the scope creep, and that's why the scope of the joint committee has been very important as the start point. Before we get delegations, before we get all the financial challenges of the system, that we're clear we've got a foundation and a platform from which to build. So that was my quick point, Jenny. Thank you.
Yeah, really helpful, really important point. So, and I can see there's some back and forth in the chat on some of the technicalities here, and also a really good question from John to ask you to illustrate some of the decisions you've been taking. But I'm going to just, at this point, put a pause so that we have a chance to hear from our second case study. And perhaps if we run out of time, we could pick up some of those questions in the chat or connect to you both afterwards, because it's a great question from John. So can I just turn now to Lucy, who's been a regular contributor to this series of webinars. Thank you very much, Lucy, for doing another turn on the programme. He's going to just talk us through the different approach that's been taken by Wyatt and how your governance has evolved over time. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks very much, Jenny. So yes, as Jenny said, I've contributed to some of these things before, so apologies if I go over any old ground. If we can just go to the first slide, please. So just a bit of context really before we get into the meat of the conversation. So Wyatt, or the West Yorkshire Association of Acute Trusts, is a collaboration of the 6 acute trusts across West Yorkshire and Harrogate. So that's a mixture of small district general hospitals, medium to large DGHs, and a big large tertiary teaching centre at Leeds Teaching Hospitals. So it's been established since 2016. It's very much a sort of collaboration rather than an organisation, and working together over that period really focused around a mechanism to share best practice, how to learn from one another, and equally trying to drive out any unwarranted variation, whether that be inequalities in access, outcomes or experience. And that's very much been the driver since the start, and I'll talk a little bit about how that's evolved since 2016. Effectively, we do a range of things. So there's we have acute trust focused change programs. So a lot of what we do in the nicest possible way sort of doesn't really impact on other areas. It's very much about how we run services in the acute hospital, and for those things that don't impact the way patients access services or impact any sort of quote unquote commissioning budgets, that's very much kind of how we drive our business through our committee and common structure. Really importantly, it facilitates clinical operational collaboration and sort of mutual aid, which has become the buzz term since the pandemic. And also having that forum to make some of those mature system decisions. So thinking about investments like capital, we have collective conversations about what schemes are going to give us the most benefit, and how do we prioritise those as a collaborative and as part of the integrated care system, rather than everybody just putting in their kind of wish list into a bidding process. I've mentioned it's not an organisation. That's really important. It's only what we do together. It's not doing things to the trusts. The trusts are Wyatt. And really importantly, we're about peer support rather than performance management. Can I have the next slide, please? So just in terms of that evolution piece, I think this is really important, because I think it shows that the sort of governance structure has underpinned this as we've transferred through, but equally I think it sets us some challenges we'll need to think about in the future as we continue to evolve. So we started life with a small number of shared transformation programs, and I wouldn't describe those as low-hanging fruit, but they weren't the kind of most wicked issues that we had to face. And that kind of brought people together and demonstrated the impact of collaboration. We then kind of did a significant piece of work, which was sort of driven by a clinical Senate review, which was about reconfiguration of vascular services. And that was really significant in terms of moving us on a step. So we led a lot of clinical engagement work as a group of trusts and made a recommendation to commissioners at the time about where our arterial centres should be. And that required some really mature discussion and decisions between the leadership across Wyatt. Obviously, then the huge sort of seismic shift came during COVID, because we'd already got some of our structures in place, because we had regular meetings, we had a lot of executive peer support in place. Actually, that really supported us in terms of being able to test out those really tricky decisions with each other, which at the start of the pandemic, everybody was kind of grappling with. There was a broad audience there to kind of work through tricky issues together. That enactment of mutual aid, whether that, be critical care in the early part of the pandemic, or more broadly about sort of G&A bed capacity further into the pandemic, we had those forums to have those discussions. We worked through our escalation frameworks locally, and equally worked through the escalation about if and when we would need to open the Nightingale Hospital. And then sort of was kind of, I would say, between the blue and the green box now. Where we're really heading is this space around shared operational networks. So a lot of the work we've done has been about where have we got services that aren't sustainable for the future in their current configuration. And that's, as you would expect, either driven by demand, but primarily by workforce constraints, and particularly medical workforce constraints. So theologies, as I would say, we have been working through a number of those and thinking about what the sort of more network solution to that would look like in the future. And as those start to move into business as usual, there's this sort of question mark about how we run those as part of BAU within the sort of collaborative spirit of Wyatt. So you can kind of go down a really transactional route, which is things like lead provider contracts, which work really effectively. But how do we maintain that collaborative feel, but equally make it clear that the accountability that sits within each organisation, but the collective accountability we hold together about delivery to a whole population. Equally, we're focused on expanding our what I would call loose networks. So these are the forums where clinicians or subject matter experts come together to share best practice, look at evidence base, and continue to support quality improvement through those loose networks. And then something we've been doing more often is that leadership on behalf of the system. So there are actually some priorities which we lead, which are much more cross-cutting in terms of involvement from other sectors, not just the acutes. However, it makes sense. So elective recovery, diagnostics, that as the major providers of those services, we lead that work, but equally we lead it in a way which is engaging the broader system. So next slide, please. So what does make Wyatt work? So I'm really conscious when I was thinking about this conversation is broadly about, some of the technical stuff that kind of previous presenters referred to. So thinking about our joint committee model, and I will talk about that, but I think it's really important to say that the reason it works is it's all underpinned by a shared vision, a really common purpose. We all understand what we're there to do together, and equally what Wyatt is not there to do together. There are many parts of our business that just need to be run in the organisation or need to be run through collaborations with partners at place. We're really clear about what we need to do together as Wyatt. But the really, really crucial thing in all of this is those real long-standing relationships that have been built since 2016. So all of this is built on trust. It's built on those established relationships. So the governance framework is the kind of bit on paper we can all recognise, but it's that softer stuff around it that really makes it work. So on to the next slide, please. So then just to talk a bit about our governance framework. So I've mentioned already we have a committee in common model and have done since we set out. That's underpinned by a memorandum of understanding, which we signed in 2017. Quite happy to share a copy of that if anybody's interested. Effectively, our committee in common is the chairs and chief execs of the 6 organisations. It meets on a quarterly basis and is really there to kind of oversee and direct the work that we do collaboratively. And so our big decisions, big business cases, for example, go to the committee in common for support. And I say support because it's really important in this, because it's a committee in common model. It is the trust boards that have the ultimate decision-making power. And that's really important in this because I think this is what's gained the ownership. So those organisations are not giving up their sovereignty. They are not giving up their decision-making power. Ultimately, that rests with those boards. And that means we get really good ownership on things. And this structure on here demonstrates the kind of assurance and advisory groups. So if we are doing a business case, for example, we would take that through our chief information officers, our chief operating officers, our directors of finance, our chief nurses, medical directors. So the assurance process is really rigorous before it gets to chief execs, which are programme executive, and then ultimately to the committee in common, which means by the time you've been through that process, ultimately committee in common's well cited, and equally boards are really well cited, and chairs play a really important role in terms of making sure that non-executive directors really understand how we operate as Wire, how it works, and equally that they've got a say in what we're doing and how the kind of overall benefit of working together has an impact on individual organisations. And we try to reinforce that with all the papers are shared at all trust boards. Chief execs do an update about what we're doing at Wire at all their trust boards. So it just continues to do that kind of softer work to make sure that boards feel really engaged in the work that we're doing, and it doesn't feel sort of out with their control. So that works really effectively. Appreciate, and I will be totally honest, it is labour intensive. So this isn't a slick, quick decision-making process. This is fairly labour intensive, but it does have the desired outcome in that we've never had a case make its way through this assurance structure and through committee in common that's then been kicked out of a trust board. So I think it's just that balance of actually, particularly at the start when you're trying to get people engaged in a new way of working, because this, particularly for NEDs, I think is a new way of thinking when their statutory responsibilities are to the organisation. Actually, this really works as a way of kind of taking some of those decisions that we need to take together. And then on to the last slide. And then I just wanted to really talk about, so I'd made the point earlier about there are some things that we can do within our power as a group of trusts, but equally some of those big decisions like I talked about with vascular, or if there are big system investments, actually I think it's really important to be clear about where decisions are made, and ultimately if Wyatt is leading some of this, how does the committee in common model play into all our other decision-making structures? And so for those issues where there is an impact on the way patients access services, or there is an impact on how we're going to use a capital allocation to the ICS or commissioning budgets, that what we're doing is using our infrastructure to support us to make a recommendation. And at that point, that recommendation will be for decision, whether that's through the Integrated Care Board or one of its committees, but with the appropriate assurance through joint overview and scrutiny committees, for example. So it's really just kind of that transparency about we are not taking decisions behind closed doors on these big things that affect the whole system. What we're trying to do is use that existing and successful infrastructure to support us to make some recommendations into the broader system where that decision can formally be taken. And I think that really helps with the kind of broader system engagement in terms of how does a provider collaborative become part of a broader system. So Jenny, that was all I was going to say, and try to leave some time for questions. So conscious I've maybe cantered through that a little bit more quickly than I normally would, but just want to give an opportunity for some discussion.
Fantastic, Lucy. Great presentation, and again, lots of rich insights from a very different approach. Can I encourage people to come in with comments, questions? Do just raise your virtual hand. Give people a chance to put any questions in the chat. Checking that I haven't missed anybody. I've got Naomi. Great, Naomi, do come on in. I've got several hands, so Naomi, do come in first.
I sneaked in there first. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Lucy. Lucy, sorry if this is a bit of a noddy question, but could you just explain to me the difference in the kind of decision-making processes that happen at your kind of exec level with the CEOs and then with the chairs and the CEOs, just kind of how that interacts with each other?
Yeah, and actually this is a really, this is a point I didn't actually mention, Ira, so thank you for prompting me. So I think the other thing about all of this is that big infrastructure, actually, in terms of decision making, in sort of proportion to the work of the collaborative, is very small. So the times you need to deploy this kind of big infrastructure, I'm talking about, you know, big capital investments. So we're building a big single aseptics hub that's going to serve all of the trusts, for example. The kind of options appraisal process we have been through for that, for where we're going to site it, how we're going to run it, is absolutely something we've engaged all those groups with, through to the committee in common and through to trust boards, because ultimately that type of investment is a board level decision in SFIs. A huge amount of what we do, 80 to 90%, you know, doesn't need to make its way through all of this. And this is more about, we use that sort of chief executive forum, which is the program exec, on a monthly basis to do that. Here's the view of everything we're doing, you know, that kind of really kind of highlight reporting. This is where we're up to. This is what's on track. This is what's gone off. This is what we need to unblock. Here are some issues that are being brought forward, and we need to do something else. Is that start a new project, have a short-term, you know, task and finish type action? You know, quite often it will be actually, can we put the medical directors group in charge of that issue and just come back to it? So it's very kind of, what we don't do is completely not then share any of that with committee in common through chairs, because it's really important they've got the context of all the work that we're doing collaboratively. But that kind of, when we pull the lever on, here's a big decision, is, I would say, comparatively few and far between.
Not a noddy question at all, Naomi. Always good to ask. Thanks for that, Lucy. Helen, I did see your hand flash up. Don't know whether that was a genuine.
Yeah.
You come on in, Helen, and I've seen Sohab. I'll throw to you in a sec.
Hi, Lucy. Yeah, that was going to be my question, actually. Very similarly to Naomi's, probably a little bit more direct, was going to be about just the time and the sort of the transaction costs around that joint committee and how you work that through with a more sort of discursive, negotiated, how you factored that into your decision making. But I think you've kind of answered that. So thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Sohab, did you still want to come in?
Yeah, a couple of quick points, if I may. So, Lucy, you're a committee in common approach, I understand, correct?
Yeah.
Where next? And is there appetite to go anywhere else? Is one question. And then the second part of that question is, well, you've been going for a little while now, since 2016. Do you think, or has there been impact as a consequence of the programs you've been doing over that period of time? And what have been the challenges or blockages to making greater impact, for want of a better word?
Great question, Sohab.
Great. So on the where next point, I think that's something we're looking at. So I'm going to be a bit on the fence on this one, in terms of I'm kind of in the place of, if it ain't broke, which it isn't, it does work. Do we need to spend time and energy wrangling about, is it a joint committee versus a committee in common? What impact's that going to make? And is that really going to change the impact we're making for patients and the colleagues that work in our services? So I think that's the big question mark. I think if the answer to that is yes, then we would seriously consider, do we need to move it on? I think some of the challenges that we've got in the kind of the working in the new way and some of the evolution I talked about is one of the hot topics in Committee in Common at the moment is this kind of what's our risk management approach? How do we manage risk? How do we manage risk in the system? How does that relate to how the ICB manages risks and we manage risk at place? And to be quite honest, I don't think anybody's got the answer at the moment. So that's sort of what we're trying to work through, because I think previously it's been reasonably straightforward in we've got programs, risks are inherent within programs, and that's about, you know, delivery to time, budget, benefits, etc. Where the space we've maneuvered into is obviously then this carrying of system risk, particularly where we've got fragile services. And I think it's that piece around how's that owned? How do we discharge responsibility and ownership around that? And where does the mitigation sit? So I think there's a big piece to kind of work through around that. And that, again, might impact how we need to be structured in order that we feel that we're effectively managing risk. So it's a kind of, it ain't broke, but never say never on that front. I think you need to do whatever works for you locally. So actually it's that clarity piece around, do we feel comfortable? Like previous presentation, absolutely, people were in a place of comfort around joint committee makes sense for these reasons. We've kind of made it work, and therefore we're very in the, do we need to tip everything out and start again if we can still use what we've already got? In terms of impact, absolutely. So I would talk about reconfiguration of services in terms of benefits for patients around things like length of stay, experience, bed base. I would talk about short-term mutual aid, which has meant patients haven't had to move because we've sent surgeons to other sites from other trusts, which just wouldn't have happened in the past, in order to continue to deliver services. I would talk about particularly the level of capital investment we've had into our system as a result of us often being able to go in with a cohesive bid. So technology, things like laboratory information management system, image reporting, sharing systems, all of these things, because we've presented a case as a group of 6 trusts covering a population of 2.7 million people. We've been very fortunate in that those cases have progressed, and therefore we've been able to use some of those as enablers to working differently. Aseptics hub, you know, potentially we've got 3 new hospitals potentially coming on our doorstep. So that power of working together, I think, supports you to, it's a bit perverse, isn't it, sometimes, because almost then you are able to accelerate more because you attract the resource in to see, can you go even further? So I definitely talk about the benefit of some of that. The challenges and blockages, I think the question before, you know, it can be slow. It can be like wading through treacle. It can be 6 steps forward and 4 steps back. That kind of work around taking everybody with you and is everybody in the tent is labour intensive. But what I would say about that is, in doing that, you build the relationships and it becomes much more straightforward then. And equally, if there are miscommunications or misunderstandings, they become very easy to sort out rather than kind of, you know, rain stops play on some of this. So it's the kind of just recognizing that actually if you work through some of these, it then sets precedent in terms of how you operate in the future. So I would see a lot of those. I would say it's mainly down to kind of communication. Is everybody cited on the same thing? Have we got a single version of the truth about what's happening, and not the kind of Chinese whispers about is service X falling over and whose fault's that and all that stuff? I think create the right climate, and then these things just get called out and people have the honest conversation rather than those conversations that happen around the periphery. And so I'd say all of those challenges we've had have been a kind of the learning point for success in the future. So I think whatever you set up in your local system, you will go through some of that. And it's almost like we kind of need to go through it to get it right. Does that help?
Great question, Adam. Thanks. There's no way around the frank conversations that need to be had, whatever your governance arrangements. Thank you so much, Lucy, for that great presentation. I'm just going to briefly bring in now Carly Caton and Christian Dingwall, partners from Brown Jacobson. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. We are doing a joint publication at NHS Providers with Grant Jacobson on provider collaborative governance. And we just wanted, before we finish today, to just flash up the headlines of the publication to do a sense check with you, and that it will pick up perhaps some of the more technical points we haven't had a chance to explore in as much detail as we might today. So Christian and Carly, over to you.
Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't, please do say so. My name is Christian Dingwall. I'm here this morning with my colleague Carly Caton. We're two of the authors of this proposed publication, joint publication with NHS Providers. We're really pleased to be doing this joint publication. Both NHS Providers and we think it's would be really timely for this type of publication. If we go to the there's only one slide really here after the title slide. That sets out at the moment the proposed issues that we would be covered in this publication. But what we're really keen to do is to engage with people like you about this publication to understand the challenges and issues that you're facing. So if you do have particular issues or challenges in your local collaborations and systems that you would like to raise with us, then please do so. There'll be probably time for a few minutes discussion after I've spoken, but there'll be plenty of time afterwards for us to engage with you. So please do engage with us. Why do we think this is timely? In part because we think that there is nationally, if not confusion, then at least a lack of shared understanding, shared terminology around provider collaboration. Indeed, what do we mean by collaboration? There are different types of collaboration. We've had case studies about two types of different collaboration. So it's to understand the different types of collaboration that might happen, because both the presentations this morning have demonstrated how much really can be done without using the new powers following last year's Health and Care Act. An enormous amount can be done under the previous powers, but nevertheless, my sense, and colleagues who have spoken will know better than this, is that they're reaching the point where they're pushing now at the boundaries of what they can do unless they adopt some of the new powers under the Health and Care Act. Why would you actually need to have a joint committee? I think that Lucy had made a really, really very important point, that if your existing governance works for you, stick with it. Don't change things just because you can have a joint committee. If you don't need a joint committee, don't have a joint committee. As for committees in common, there's a huge amount of confusion or different understandings about what we mean by committees in common. For example, I hear people saying that they would like to have committees in common as a precursor to a joint committee. They'd like to evolve by way of committees in common into a joint committee. My response to that is committees in common, true committees in common for shared decision making are in actual fact more complex, more bureaucratic than joint committees. And if one goes back to the white paper that preceded the last year's legislation, the white paper explains that part of the purpose of the legislation is to remove complexity and bureaucracy around shared decision making where there aren't shared decision making powers. Having said that, I can't emphasize enough to you just how complex this area is. I think that everything that's been discussed so far points towards that this is really a really complex area. It's not the job of lawyers to get in the way of what you're trying to do. It's the job of lawyers to try and help you do what you want to do. And I would emphasize as well that it's the job of lawyers to try and help you keep it as simple as possible in what is a very complex area. So I'll pause there and I'll just see if Carly would have anything to add to what I've said there before we hand back to Jenny? Carly.
No, I think you've covered it really nicely. It's just around, why collaborate, why governance is important, and following that through, and just trying to seek to be as useful and practical as possible, and to make things simpler for you, and sort of set it all out in one place, because I think there is confusion, like Christian said. So thanks, Christian.
Thanks very much to you both. And I'm kind of conscious of time, so what I'm going to suggest is that there's a quite kind of question in the chat, which Carly and Christian, you might pick up. Can colleagues please pop in the chat any comments on that lineup from the publication, any specific issues that you would like us to raise? Obviously, we will reflect on today's session and make sure it picks up the key themes. It's going to be published in the autumn, Andy, and we will circulate further details in the follow-up email to today. Just as a quick, thank you, just in terms of pulling things together, can I just thank Christian and Carly, but also particular thanks to Lucy, Selina and Caris, just fantastic presentations. I think to have the contrast in the models has been really given us some really rich insight. I think some of the themes, if I dare to try and sum up, about doing what works locally, as Christian just said, if it works for you, stick with it. And I think there's been a lot of conversation about this being a journey. One size doesn't fit all, and the key thing is to make sure your governance arrangements evolve over time to reflect the ambitions of your provider collaborative and the particular configuration of arrangements you've got locally. So a really good discussion on the opportunities opened up by joint committees to look across the piece at how you best meet local need and allocate resources accordingly, but lots of detail to work through. And Lucy from Wyatt giving that perspective on committees in common, that it can be labour intensive, but it really has enabled them to keep ownership and engagement and take everybody with them. And then, of course, the usual themes about whatever model you take, what really matters is the quality of the relationships that underpin your governance arrangements, the shared purpose you have, whether you've got that senior buy-in, clinical voice. And I thought the really powerful challenge from North East London about the service user voice, and whether you're ready to respond to the challenges and from service users and really adapt your ways of behaviour and mindsets accordingly. So thank you so much to all the speakers. And we're going to just pop a link in the chat to our evaluation. Please just take a second if you can, just to give us some feedback so we know how we can tailor our future events to meet your needs. If you haven't got time to complete the evaluation form, just put any feedback in the chat. Can I just give a quick plug to a programme that we're launching next week on shared approaches to improvement across provider collaboratives and how you can hardwire equity into those approaches. So we're really wanting to work with something we know is at very early days, but how can we share learning about those shared approaches to improvement with equity in mind? And then a plug for our forthcoming events as part of this programme. We've got a next provider collaborative peer learning forum, which is for directors of strategy and programme directors, coming up on the 19th of July. Everybody's very welcome to attend. Sorry, that is for acute members only. We've got parallel sessions for our mental health trust members. And then the next webinar in this series is in September, focusing on working with partners at place. So thank you very much, everybody. We just squeaked in on time. We will send a note in the follow-up email covering the points we've raised, but thank you for joining us this morning.